Hello, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate Pit Count office hour for the 2021 point-in-time count. My name is Tommy Joe Badnow. I'm going to go over a few pieces of housekeeping and logistical pieces of information before we get started in earnest today. First and foremost, as I'm sure many of you will want to know, today's session is being recorded, and so that recording, along with the slide deck, a copy of the chat, and the questions and answers will be posted to the HUD Exchange. That'll be up in about 2 to 3 business days, so we will make those available, but give us a few days to make those accessible and post them there. And all that information can be found on the HUD Exchange at the link on your screen now. We'll also provide that during the session today if you want to look at any of the past recordings. While everyone is muted at the moment, we do hope that, 1, you can hear us to the best ability, and 2, that you have the opportunity to ask verbal questions later. So for better audio, and especially to ask good questions later on, we encourage you to join the webinar audio via the phone number on your screen. It's just a little bit more reliable than computer audio, though computer audio works as well. That phone number is also in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen now. Speaking of the chat, again, while everyone is muted at the moment, we hope that throughout this webinar and towards the end during our question and answer session that you will ask questions, share your experiences and what's going on in your communities. The first and foremost way to do that is to use the chat box. To open the chat feature on the bottom of your screen, as shown in the screenshot below, in the red box you'll see a little chat button, has a little chat bubble and the word chat. If you click on that, it'll open a pane on the right-hand side of your screen with a chat box. To make sure that your comments go to all of our presenters today and to your other attendees, please make sure the to-line is selected to everyone. Again, that's everyone, so that your questions, comments, and experiences will go to everyone today. When we get to the end of our session, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. If you'd like to verbally ask a question, please go ahead and hit the little raise hand feature. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screenshot on the screen now and on the right-hand side of your screen, if you have that pane open, there's a little hand. If you click on that, that will virtually raise your hand so that we know to unmute you so that you can ask a question verbally. And if you've already asked your question or your question has been asked by someone else or you just no longer want to ask your question, please click it one more time to lower your hand. That way we'll know your question's been answered, or you just don't want to ask the question anymore. With that, our presenters for today will be William Snow from the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, SNAPS at HUD, Aubrey Sittler from Apt Associates, Megan Henry from Apt Associates, and myself, Tommy Joe Bednar from Apt Associates. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to William Snow. William?
All right. Thank you very much. Looking forward to today. I realize today's the 12th. That means we're on like the countdown. We have about 10 days until the last 10 days of January hit us, so pretty exciting. Next slide, please. Want to talk about a few things today, just what are the requirements. This is the same thing we've been sharing. It's a little bit altered now due to the memo that came out on January 7th, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. So nothing has changed with regard to the HIC. Nothing has changed with regard to sheltered pit count requirements. They're both required. We expect every COC to do that. No exception, no waiver. The unsheltered pit count. There are flexibilities doing the count, same things as we've said before. If you're going to do the count, if you're not going to do the count, you do have that option. You can use the waiver ability. You don't need to seek an exception starting as of January 7th if you are only going to do some, or if you don't want to, or if you're unable, I guess, to do the unsheltered count this year, you're able to take advantage of that waiver. You do need to send a notification to us, and again, we'll get to those details. Next slide, please. So we talked about the flexibilities in the past. I'm going to keep them up there because I just want people to be reminded that those flexibilities haven't changed based on the CPD memo, right? Safety still is our first priority. The overall messaging that safety is the first decision that you make with the point-in-time count with regard to 2021 in particular. The flexibilities we talked about with either doing short surveys or more observation-based, more sampling, all that still applies. Prior to the memo being released, we were saying you can seek a full exception or a partial exception. The waiver doesn't really impact that much. The same large concept is in place. We just have a few changes to mechanism, and we just want to make sure we're covering legal bases. That's actually the primary reason we're doing it. So let's jump to the next slide, please. So just to bear in mind the things that remain in terms of actions that need to be taken towards HUD, right? We still have the ability to seek a waiver from doing the unsheltered point in time count, or a waiver to do a head count or something less than the full count. So that's the big change here. The memo does change that. It essentially says you're seeking a waiver, you're not seeking an exception. This really only applies for those COCs that did not do a count in 2020. I know folks had asked that early on, what if we did a count, do we have to do anything? And our answer was, yes, you do. That's the guidance we were given. We also do kind of the national count in odd years, so every COC is required generally in odd years to count. All of that stuff is the piece that we got waived in the memo, so that's nice. So if you did not count in 2020, you absolutely have to take advantage of the waiver memo if you're going to not do a full count, right? So if you're going to do either a partial count or no count, you still must do the waiver. If you did a count in 2020, an unsheltered count in 2020, and you want to do something less than the full count, you actually don't need to send an exception to me. You don't need to even send a waiver notification either. You actually have that ability, and so the memo gives us that legal cover, so we're grateful for that. Two things, though, that you do need to bear in mind. If you want to use an alternate data set, you still have to talk to me. That has to do with, is the data you're presenting or going to be using valid? Does it count as a sufficient substitute for the unsheltered pit count? So, yes, nothing changes with those. You still need to come to me, and we need to go through that if you plan on using an alternate data set. You still need to seek an exception in the same process as before if you are going to change the date from the last 10 days of January. So nothing has changed with regard to that as well. Next slide, please. So the pit count waiver, again, I put the question there that people are probably really asking, why did HUD do that, especially on January 7th? Again, the real reason is to ensure we have legal cover for those who did not do a count in 2020. This is the way to meet the legal requirement. So even if you emailed me and got an exception, if you did not do an unsheltered count in 2020, you still have to send an email to 2021 PIT at HUD.gov stating that you will be taking advantage of the whatever waiver you're going to do. And again, we'll go over that in just a second. So I just want to put a fine point on that, though. You still must seek that waiver even if you got language or an email from me allowing the exception. So that's really important. You will have a legal obligation to do the unsheltered count if we don't get that email. That's how important that is. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is what I was kind of drumming, just a reminder. If you did a count, an unsheltered count in 2020, and you want to do something less than the full unsheltered count, you actually don't have to send anything anymore. The requirement to send an exception email is no longer valid. You don't need to do that. You're kind of off the hook in terms of notification to HUD. The big one is if you did not do a count in 2020, you must send the notification. Otherwise, you have a legal obligation to do the count. Next slide, please. So what do you need to send to us? If you're going to seek a waiver, again, the waiver would be something either less than the full count, the full unsheltered count, or no unsheltered count at all, one of those two. You need to send that notification to 2020 PIT at HUD.gov. You need to have your COC name and number and tell us what exactly you're seeking the waiver for. If you're in a situation where you don't want to do the full unsheltered count, but you want to do more than the total head count, what you need to do is still seek a waiver to do the head count. It doesn't prohibit you from collecting more data. So you can collect more. You'll even have the chance likely to submit that. We're still, again, ironing out HDX, but our plan is to let you submit what you can. So if you did more, that's fine. You can still submit it. So this is more just, again, about the legal requirement for if you're going to do less than the full count, but something, you still need to seek that waiver notification. And again, it really only applies to those who did not do a count in 2020. So that's the big one. Also, this is a change. So for the exception pieces, we've been saying you have all sorts of flexibility in timing. That still applies, actually, if you're going to change the date. It still applies if you're going to use an alternate data set. But if you are seeking a waiver under this memo, you must submit by noon Eastern time on January 20th. That's the legal requirement. That's what's in the memo. So again, if I don't get that notification from you by that time, I'm going to assume that you're going to meet your obligation to do an unsheltered count otherwise. So that's a pretty important one. Again, I keep drumming it in terms of you got to do it if you didn't do a count in 2020, just because you got to hear it, you got to know, you've got to send us that notification. And this date now applies if you're in that. Now, I will say, just to be very clear, there are 46 CoCs that fall in that group out of 390. It's not a very large group, right? It's around 15% of CoCs did not do a 2020 count. So if you're unsure if that applies to you, you can send me an email. I'm happy to confirm one way or the other. If I were you and you're not sure, send the email, because you definitely want to make sure you have cover on that one. All right, next slide, please. All right, so again, the other things still apply. So if you're going to seek an exception to the date, you need to still give good cause, send an email to me stating good cause, stating when you're going to change the count to. So that still applies. That's the same as in past notices. Next slide, please. If you want to use an alternate data set, I'm going to work under the assumption you're going to submit some sort of unsheltered data. Obviously, if you're going to use some sort of other data set, whether you're going to submit all of the normal elements or some, but you plan on doing whatever it is through an alternate data set, you need to come to me. You need to be able to prove that that is a valid alternate data set. That generally requires you running the data on the night of your last unsheltered pit count, comparing the results to the last unsheltered pit count data you submitted to HUD, and then checking how close the data is. Generally, we're looking in a ballpark of within 2 to 5%. The data matches within 2 to 5%. So that's pretty important. If it's outside that range, you're definitely going to have to be prepared to do some more explaining, and whether that's up or down. And if you didn't have that data set in place in the past when you did your last unsheltered count, there are ways to still approve that. We've approved a few for communities, but again, you just have to say why you think that the data set is valid. And just saying, because I think it is, won't work, right? You're going to have to provide some sort of reason with data showing, yeah, these are the reasons we think it works. So that's going to be harder if you're in that camp. Again, it's possible. Just be prepared for back and forth and be prepared to provide a lot of documentation up front. All right. Let's go to the next slide, please. Cool. That covers my content. I'm going to turn it back to Sanjay.
All right. Thank you so much, William, for slogging through all of that. We want to go ahead and cover a few common questions that we already know have come up or come in through the AAQ desk about this new information. And I think these are going to be straight for you, William. But the first is whether there's a deadline for requesting an unsheltered pit count exception or waiver, and can you submit an updated exception or waiver if circumstances change in the local COC?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the answer now depends, right? Before we had one policy for all of it, but if you're seeking a waiver and you are one of those COCs that did not count in 2020, yes, there is a deadline. You need to do it by January 20th, noon Eastern time. So that does apply. If you're seeking an exception to the date or an alternate data set, you're hoping to use that, you can send that to me without a timeline, right? That generally I expect to see them before the last 10 days of January. But again, if there's an emergency, there still could be a snowstorm, right? COVID has stopped a lot of things, but it hasn't stopped the weather. So you don't know what's coming. You may need something on January 28th. Send those to me. We're going to honor those, right? We want to help you with that. And if you've received an exception already, but you need to update it, yeah, just send that to me. For the most part, again, if you did an unsheltered count in 2020, you actually don't really need to send me an updated email. If you choose to do less, that's okay. You can do that. You can just move forward. That waiver gives you the ability to take that action without going back to us. So I appreciate it if you notify us so that we just are aware, but you don't have to.
Thank you so much, William. And common recurring question we have about the purchase of PPE. Is that purchase of PPE for the unsheltered pit count an eligible expense?
Yeah, we love that you guys are looking at this because you should definitely take advantage of your funding on this. The COC planning dollars are widely available, right, in terms of what you can spend money on. And using that funding for PPE as part of the unsheltered pit count, absolutely eligible. For both COC and ESG, if you're getting street outreach funding, the answer is maybe. So if you are purchasing the PPE to deliver or hand to those that you're counting, yes, that's an outreach activity. You can pay for the PPE with that funding and provide it to those that you're asking questions to. For those who are conducting the counts, whether it be staff or volunteers, you can use ESG admin funds to pay for PPE for them, or for your street outreach folks, if they're engaged in street outreach activities, you can use PPE for them. So if they're doing an observation count where they're, again, in a car, counting heads, no, you can't use PPE for that. They're not engaging in street outreach activities. However, if they are doing normal street outreach activities, right, getting out, engaging with people, offering them services, yes, you can use both COC and ESG street outreach dollars to pay for PPE for your street outreach teams.
Thank you for working through the nuance on that, William. Just one more common question before we move on. If a COC has already submitted an exception request to you, William Snow, do they have to submit a waiver notification to the 2021 PIT at HUD.gov email address?
Yeah, great question. So this applies only to those COCs that did not conduct a count in 2020. If you are one of those COCs, even if you have sent me an email and received an acceptance, you still need to make sure you send an email to that 2021 PIT at HUD.gov email address by January 20th at noon Eastern time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're going to go through just a couple of resources that we want to make sure we highlight what's updated and what's available. Many of these links have already been dropped into the chat by Aubrey Sittler, and we'll continue to provide them periodically in the chat. And again, the hyperlinks will be available to the slides once they're posted. First and foremost of these resources is the new CPD Memo on the availability of waivers for the unsheltered pit count. That is what William has been discussing through the majority of this presentation so far. The rest of the resources posted here are documents that we've shared with you before, including the previous conducting the 2021 unsheltered pit count, the wonderful how to use sampling within a COC guide, an example of a pit count observation form that was posted just after our last pit count webinar, or pit count office hours, and some updates to the HMIS project setup and inventory changes. As William has said in a few of our previous pit count office hours, the 2021 HIC and pit count notice has not yet been released, but will largely not be very different from the guidance in these other documents and the guidance that's been shared verbally and in writing through AAQs and on this webinar as well.
Hey, Tommy Joe, let's just jump in on that notice. So the waiver memo is going to replace what we do with the notice. It essentially said the notice, the last notice in place, which is actually tied to the 2019 count, still applies except for these waiver authorities. So you should not expect to see a notice at this point. It won't be released. It's just that memo that now will apply. And again, it accepts the waiver or the notice, the last notice published, so that still stands. It just gave you the ability to seek the waiver. So that, just to be clear on that point.
Thank you so much for that update, William. And as some general pit count resources on the Pit Count and HIC landing page on the HUD Exchange, also the Pit Count Methodology Guide, all of our previous Pit Count office hours recordings, slides, chat, Q&A, and the Pit Count survey tools. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, this is our penultimate Pit Count office hours for the 2021 Pit and HIC, which means we have one more on January 19th. That will be our last one for this set at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That registration link is on the slide, and we'll drop it in the chat for you all. And as we transition to our Q&A section of today's webinars, we would love to hear from all of you. What topics, what questions would you like to see covered in that final Pit Count office hours for this 2021 set? So feel free to add those topic suggestions into the chat so that we can make sure to consider covering those in the next one. With that, we are going to move into question and answer for our webinar today. I'd like to remind you that while everyone is muted at the moment, we do want you to have the opportunity, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, to raise your hand. To do so, just click on the little hand on the right-hand side pane. If you have a question that you'd like to ask verbally, we'll call on you and unmute you to let you know that you can ask your question verbally. At the moment, we don't see anyone with a raised hand, so we're going to go ahead and move into Q&A from some of your questions that have come in through the chat. And we're going to go ahead and go to some of those. I think, William, these are mostly going to go to you to start with. Someone just wanted to know what the exact time deadline is for submitting a waiver on January 20th. Is it noon or is it 5 p.m. Eastern?
Yeah, sorry. It is 5 p.m. That's a good catch. 5 p.m. Eastern time on January 20th. That is the correct time. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Thank you so much for telling us, William. We have another individual who's asking if the new memo requires just notification to use the available waivers, or do they still have to get approval for HUD to use them?
Yep, just notification. So that's great. You should not expect an email response back unless you're asking about or asking a question. It's, again, notification only, and it applies immediately upon receipt. So you send it January 20th at 4:49. It applies at 4:49.
Wonderful. And to combine a couple of questions that we've had, and I think to talk a little bit about something that you mentioned earlier, if a COC has already received, emailed you prior to the new memo coming out and had received an exception request, do they need to still email via the new process to use the waiver?
Right. So the short answer is it depends. If you fall in that camp of you did not conduct a count in 2020, an unsheltered count in 2020, yes, you must absolutely send an email to 2021pit@hud.gov. If you did a count, an unsheltered count in 2020, then no, you don't actually need to take any other action.
Wonderful. So, William, a little nuanced / potentially marginal situation question. What happens in a COC if the public health guidance, such as a new stay-at-home order, changes after January 20th, but before the date of the COC's point-in-time count?
I guess the question is, what are you asking it in relation to, right? So I'm guessing you're planning on conducting a count, and then the stay-at-home order is issued, and then you don't know what to do next. So I'm going to answer based on that. It depends what scenario you stand in. If you did a count in 2020, and you now are not sure if you're going to do a count at all because of the stay-at-home order, you actually have that ability. I saw one of the questions in the chat was, hey, you were saying we have to do a count in 2021. The memo came out, and now Norm said, and the memo seems to say that you don't have to do a count in 2021. Yes, that's what the memo altered. So if you did a count in 2020 and you were planning on doing a count anyways in 2021, but something alters the situation, stay-at-home order or something else, and you say, well, I really can't do a count now, you have the ability to opt out. Without providing notification to us, you simply have that authority to do it. Again, this all applies only to the unsheltered count. It does not apply to your HIC and your sheltered count.
Wonderful. So if a COC did not do a count in an unsheltered pit count in 2020 and request an exemption, a waiver for the count in 2021, should COCs assume that they will be required to do a full unsheltered count in 2022?
So that's a tough question. I can't really speak to 2022. The way we've operated, the reason why this was so complicated this year, among other things, was we essentially require a full count every other year, and we've done it in odd years. That way we have a national set of data at least every other year. That's one of the reasons we kept saying 2021 is a required year, you're going to have to do it. The waiver partly clarified that, no, you're not going to have to actually for this. Are we going to require something in 2022? Likely, yes. So especially if you didn't do a count, right? Legally, you're going to have to do a count in 2022 per the regulation. But if you do a count this year, what's going to happen in 2022? I suspect whether through NOFA incentives or other regulatory requirements, you're probably going to have to do it. I can't speak with certainty on that, though, so you'll just kind of have to keep your eyes peeled. But if I were you, I would definitely count on preparing for a count in 2022.
Wonderful. And I just want to remind everyone on the webinar, if you would like to ask your question verbally, you can raise your hand clicking on that little hand feature in the right-hand pane of the WebEx screen. And if you are on the phone, you can hit *3 on your phone if you'd like to ask your question verbally. That will raise your hand in WebEx, even if you're just on your phone or on your phone for audio, so that we know that you'd like to ask that question verbally. At this point, we don't have any raised hands, though, so we're going to return to some chat questions. And William, just to ask one more time, if a COC conducted a 2020 count, a 2020 unsheltered pit count, they do not need to notify that they don't plan to conduct one in 2021. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Perfect. We have a question about alternative data sets. Basically, if a COC is using an alternate data set to submit information on the unsheltered point in time count, if they already have an approved alternate data set from you, does the new memo and waivers affect that in any way? Is there anything that should be taken into consideration for that?
The only thing to consider is if, for whatever reason, you're not going to submit the full data set. Because there are some COCs that are using an alternate data set, but they're not collecting something like chronic. There are a few who are not doing chronic status. So if you fall in that camp and you're doing something less than the full unsheltered data submission to HUD, then yes, if you didn't count in 2020, but you're going to use an alternate data set in 2021, you still need to submit the waiver notification. And in that case, you would say, I'm seeking a waiver to do the head count only, again, knowing that you could collect more than that, but that's the waiver authority that you're going to be seeking.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. We have a raised hand from Daniela Jordan. Daniela, you are now unmuted to ask your question.
Thank you so much. I'm from the Indiana Balance of State, and my question is, we have many regions, and each region is doing something different. They're doing a short survey, but they're also doing a head count. So my question was, when we submit the report for the PIT, how are we going to report the head count? Since it's very likely that we will not have the age and ethnicity and race as accurately as maybe using a short survey. So that was my question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It was the first question I there's a lot of nuance to it, so I couldn't answer it in the chat with the time we had. So I'm glad you asked it. First of all, I would just make sure that within each region, they're being consistent, right? If they're doing a short survey in Region 1, they should be doing the short survey more or less in all of Region 1, or administering the pit count methodology in a way that ensures that there's no duplication. So that's point number one I want to make sure is implemented, because that's really important. But each region has the ability to do things slightly differently. That's okay. For your submission, you would be working on the lowest common denominator. So you don't submit by region, you submit by COC. If you have sufficient data from the regions to be able to complete the demographic data, even if you don't have it for every region, if you're confident that you can use the existing data to extrapolate to account for the regions where you don't have it, that's approach number one that you could take. If you're not confident that you could extrapolate to account for the missing data, go to whatever that lowest common denominator is, and it might be just a head count. You'll just submit the HUD, total homeless people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, instead of the other data. You can still use the other locally, just you wouldn't submit it to HUD. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you. My concern was with the errors, if I'm not able to submit all the demographics, but if I understand correctly, I should be able to report on what we've gathered, and if some of that head count is not usable for the report, I can still use it locally but not submit. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And again, I mentioned the extrapolation piece because, right, if you have 80% of the data and you're missing 20%, I wouldn't throw out that 80% for that. I would actually use the extrapolation tool to cover that remaining 20%. But if you find you're missing, like, you're missing 80% of the data, oh, yeah, I would just exclude that data and just submit the head count.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yep.
All right. If we have anyone else who would like to ask a question verbally, thank you so much, Daniela, for being a first and for raising your hand in WebEx. If anyone else would like to, please feel free to raise your hand in WebEx, or if you're joining us only via phone, to hit *3 to raise your hand. It looks like we don't have anyone else with a hand raised at this moment, so we'll move back to a few Q&A and chat questions. William, we have an individual asking if individual agencies or providers can request a waiver even if the COC does not.
No. This is all at the COC level for the pit count. So they can request it of their COC, and the COC can find a way to mitigate for that, but individual agencies cannot come to HUD seeking a waiver or an exception.
Perfect. We do have a couple of more raised hands now on our participants. So we have a call-in user with with starting in phone number 602, call-in user 602. You are now unmuted to ask your question.
Good afternoon, William. This is Ryan Vernick calling from the Arizona Department of Housing. Just wanted to clarify something with you as I've been sitting in the office hours the last couple of weeks. Obviously, things have changed, and we were just in the process of putting together our exemption request, and then we got the notification that that only the waiver was required. Now, we did do a count in 2020. Are you saying that we don't have to submit anything at all to you?
Yep, you are covered. If you did the count in 2020, you don't need to submit an email to me. You don't need to submit the waiver notification to 2021 PIT at HUD.gov. You still can if you feel like that's something that's necessary for your own local purposes, but you don't need to.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Perfect. We have another person with a hand raised who'd like to ask a question. Harry Robinson. Harry Robinson, you are now unmuted to ask your question.
Actually, you answered my question on the chat, so I'm good to go. Thank you.
Wonderful. We're glad to hear that. If anyone else has a question to ask, feel free to raise your hand, or again, if you're on the phone only, hit *3. And if your question has already been answered by someone else, or you've had the chance to ask it and have it answered, just go ahead and hit that one more time to lower your hand, or hit *3 again to lower your hand if you're on the phone only. Turning back to a few of our chat questions, William, for the sheltered pit counts, is there anything that COCs need to do differently or extra for their sheltered pit count, or just a regular sheltered pit count this year?
Gosh, is anything regular this year, right? It is more or less a regular count. The things just to bear in mind that may kind of put a wrinkle in because of COVID include things like temporary emergency shelter funded through ESGCB. What do you count those as? You would count those as normal shelter. We'll have a funding source in the HIC, so you can identify it as ESGCB, but just include it as a shelter and include the people sleeping in it as those in the sheltered pit count. I saw a question from Valerie, and I think there are others who have this similar question about safe sleeping sites that are not traditional shelters and don't even qualify really as temporary emergency shelter, but more like sanctioned encampments. Those will continue to be treated as unsheltered, and you will not include either the tents or the people in them as part of the sheltered pit count. So that one may be a little nuanced depending on your community. So if you have further questions about, well, I'm not sure, is this sheltered or unsheltered, that we're happy to address via AAQ, or you can even attempt here if we have time to get into nuance, but we do know that there are some nuances tied to that.
Wonderful. William, thank you so much for getting ahead on a couple of questions there. As one quick follow-up on that that's very much related, we have an individual who asked about the shelter count in the HIC for COVID hotels used for decompression. So hotels used as shelters for decompression because of COVID, and they cited the example of Project Room Key in California. How should those be treated for the HIC and for the sheltered pit count?
Yeah, sorry, I should have actually covered that. That's a great one. So, you count them. So we'll start there. Really, you should follow your HMIS project setup. That's the key here, because remember, the HIC is tied back to the LSA at the end of the day. So to make sure your data all lines up across all of what you're going to report, you should essentially be following your HMIS project setup. Now, there is some nuance to that. For instance, if you were a 100-bed facility, you decompress, you have 50 beds that remained in the facility, but they were spaced out, and now you have an additional 50 beds that are being placed in a hotel, but you're essentially at 100 beds, more or less. Many of you kept that as a single project in HMIS. That's what we told you could do, and that's a great option. You are not going to have to report those folks in the decompressed hotel wing as voucher-based and then report the other 50 as facility-based. That's just impossible for you to do without setting up a new project, and we don't want you to do that. That's not worth the time. So if it's a decompressed, you're keeping more or less the same capacity, you're just going to report that as all one, and it's going to show up as a facility-based. So we're aware that some of those nuances are going to get lost when we have the final HIC data. We're comfortable with that. We don't want to make you go through crazy hoops just to get at some nuances. Yeah, we're just, there's a level of comfort we have with not bringing you discomfort. So that's our goal.
Well, William, on the note of adding one more nuance to that question, how should COCs handle FEMA-funded shelter for their sheltered pit count and their HIC?
Yeah, that's great. So a lot of the NCS shelters, it's shelter, right? So count it as shelter. And actually, that looks a little different in each COC. Sometimes FEMA is actually providing trailers. Sometimes it's providing hotels. So just consider how they're providing it to you and report it accordingly. You have some flexibility, and should it be counted as overflow, or should it be counted as voucher or facility? We actually give you, again, some discretion to think through that. The key here, though, again, especially if they're going to motels and FEMA funded, sure, that's going to be emergency shelter identified as a voucher, and that's what's going to be reported on the HIC. And then shelter, they'll be included in the sheltered pit count.
Wonderful. William, we had somebody who was asking if HUD will be updating conducting the Unsheltered 2021 Pit Count document.
So we've debated about doing that. The struggle was that memo came out, the CPD memo came out on January 7th. The count is really a week and a half from that, right? If it's 2 weeks away from it, we just decided we were not going to update that, although we may still update the description where the document is stored, stating that you need to refer to the CPD memo for seeking exceptions to do partial counts or to get an exception from doing any 2020 or 2021 unsheltered count. Wonderful.
Thank you, William. We have a few people asking about if their previous requests for exemptions, if their request for waivers and or not doing an unsheltered point in time count this year will negatively impact their COC competition application.
Yeah, that's probably the most popular question we get. The short answer is I'm legally prohibited from telling you what's in a future NOFA, so I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is our goal is to make sure that COCs can do a count safely. If you can't do a count safely, it would seem strange to penalize you for doing that. So we will do all that's in our legal power to ensure that people who do not conduct an unsheltered count due to safety are not penalized for doing so.
Wonderful. I just want to remind everyone again, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, you can click on the raise hand feature. And if you're joining via phone for audio, you can hit *3 to raise your hand. Noting that we don't have any other new raised hands at the moment, William, can a COC require volunteers, and I'm assuming volunteers for their pit count, to produce a negative COVID test in order to volunteer in that pit count?
Requirement's too strong a word here, right? So the reality is actually you as a COC can set policies as long as you apply them consistently to everyone participating. You have that flexibility. We certainly in our guidance said that there are certain protocols around negative testing and asymptomatic testing prior to the count that you should apply. If you want to apply that, you actually can. You have that ability. I'm not sure how easy it is. You'll have to consider your state. I know in my state, am not able to just go and get a test and get results. It takes whatever amount of time, and so it's just not that easy. So if you want to apply that, just recognize that's probably going to winnow out a bunch of your volunteers, and if you're comfortable with that, you can proceed with that. Again, safety is the first thing. So if that's what you're going to do to ensure safety, we're certainly not going to stand in your way of doing that. Just recognize the implications from it.
Wonderful. William, we have someone asking about ways to reduce the coverage area because of decreased volunteers during their unsheltered pit count. Could you talk about some of their options to reduce the amount of areas that they need to cover and survey?
Sure. So this is the fun of sampling. What I actually would refer you to is our second pit count office hours. I believe that was December 3rd, where we talked about sampling approaches. If I were you, I'd start by developing like groupings or a strata of the jurisdictions in your COC. So if you're a big balance of state, for instance, and you have maybe 50 or 60 counties, you may want to start by saying, well, these are kind of how I would group my counties. This is the group that has a high density, whatever that means for you, right? That could mean there's normally 100 people experiencing homelessness or more in each unsheltered count, or, right, you get to make that decision. But setting up these groupings of your jurisdictions based on what makes sense to you, right, in a large jurisdiction like a balance of state, counties is probably good. If you're a big city, lots of coverage, counties doesn't make sense, but you may use census tracts or other logical regions that exist. Start by determining what areas you have to count in. They're what we call certainty sites, right? Without counting in them, you know your count would be inaccurate. figure out if you can get to them. If you count, or if you cannot, you should probably consider seeking an exception to the count. If you can, but you can't get to everyone else, just look at what you can do and consider how many areas are you going to be able to go into based on each of the groupings, right? If you have a grouping of 15, are you going to be able to get to 5 of those? If so, that's probably going to give you enough to be able to work with for extrapolation. Depends a little on your area, but that's kind of how you should make those decisions, is start by designating the types of areas in your COC and just figure out, like, ooh, do I even have something to work with here, right? If I have 100 areas and I can get to 5 of them, yeah, you probably don't have much to work with and need to seek a full exception. If you can get to 30, 40, 50, and they're pretty dispersed across the different types of areas based on homeless population density, yeah, you can probably set up a survey regime and work with that. So again, there's a lot of nuance there, and I would encourage you to look at the December 12th Pit Count office hours and the sampling guidance for more direction on that.
Wonderful. Thank you, William. So just to confirm, should COCs expect to hear any sort of response from the 2021 PIT at HUD.gov email address if they're notifying about using waivers?
No. The notifications apply at the time that they're submitted. Again, remember the scope of that. If you're seeking to do an alternate data set, you're not going to hear from anyone from that website, but you're actually not approved to use an alternate data set without talking to me about that. So just remember the right vehicles for it, right? If you're seeking a pit count date exception or you want to use an alternate data set, those emails still have to come to me. Everything that goes into that 2021 pit count, we look at as notifications to the extent they meet the notification requirements. You shouldn't expect to hear back from us. So if you ask a question in there, there's a good chance you're not going to hear back. So I would not use that as your vehicle for asking questions. You should be using the AAQ, or you can send emails to me if you have questions.
William, if a community is only completing a head count for their unsheltered pit count, are they required to use tools such as the sample observation form in order to deduplicate?
That's a tough one. So are you required to use something? Yes, right? You need a place to tally it. If you're doing an observation, you simply need a place to identify the people. You don't really use the survey tools to do the deduplication for an observation count. The deduplication process is by virtue of how you're doing the count itself. So if you're doing a blitz count, right, you're going out and observing people in a specific area, and you're doing that on a very strict timeline, right, from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., that in and of itself is your deduplicator, right? So the tool you use won't be what you use for deduplication. You'll just use whatever data collection tool you're using to be able to tally the people identified. If you're using a survey and that's and you're doing it over multiple days and possibly even daylight hours, you absolutely need to have questions in that survey that allow you to deduplicate. And you can make the decision about what you think is sufficient to give you that deduplication ability. Obviously, that's probably like first and last name initials paired with something like birth year. You may even do a race ethnicity piece to it, or whatever combo you think will allow you to deduplicate. That's kind of up to you, but you do need to collect sufficient data to be able to make those deduplication decisions.
We have another question for William and potentially for Aubrey as well. Someone is asking if there's flexibility on how the gender questions can be asked on a survey to implement feedback that they've received from their local LGBTQ population. So
I'm going to jump in here because this is something that we feel pretty strongly about. In fact, we're already looking at the 2022 HMIS data standards updates. And one of the things we're looking at is the gender response options. So it's something we care about. We're actually looking at race and ethnicity as well. Those are important options, and we want to make sure they're representative of people. So we're looking at that. That doesn't stop you as a COC from taking that feedback. HUD gives you the elements, but we intentionally give you elements. You need to be able to respond to the response options that we give you and that you'll submit in HDX. But the way you ask questions, you have all sorts of flexibility. And if you find that that a population, again, it could be any kind of demographic, is more comfortable with one set of questions over another, you have that flexibility to tailor those questions to make sure people can feel comfortable identifying appropriately with what they identify with. Aubrey, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Would have added to begin with. Oh, sorry, thank you. I think that's the main message that I would have added to begin with as well. How you ask a question and how you submit your data are two very different things. I've seen COCs before when they've had feedback from folks where they want way more gender categories than the HUD definition actually asks for. You can ask people to identify their gender in a number of different ways, and then when you're aggregating that information later to put into the HDX, then you kind of manually or, using whatever data analysis system you're using, would then just combine those different data categories if it makes sense for the way that you submit your data. But by all means, yes, use the information that you get from folks locally, for people with lived experience, to inform how you ask questions and what the possible response options are.
So with so many different situations of communities that might be using an alternative data set or conducting their unsheltered pit count differently, a lot of communities, a lot of individuals on this webinar are asking about how HDX will be set up, or will HDX accommodate these differences? Can you speak to HDX and the data submission a little bit?
I'll defer to Aubrey and Megan first on that, and I'm happy to follow up on anything.
Can you repeat the question one more time, Tommy Jo? Sorry.
Sure. So a number of people have asked, because of the different situations of how they're conducting their unsheltered pit count or using an alternative data set, how will the HDX be set up to accommodate this, or will the HDX accommodate these differences and these nuances that are different from previous years?
Yes, most definitely the HDX will be removing a lot of the validations that everybody is probably very familiar with from all of the other years under the unsheltered count, where we do cross-checks of different populations and whether they align with the total population and sort of some of the demographic checks. All of those validations will likely be removed. And also checks such as your unsheltered count having to align with your sheltered count will likely be removed. So the HDX will just accommodate all of the exceptions that HUD is granting. We'll make sure that don't sort of exist when you try and report.
Okay. William, anything else you wanted to add to that?
Nope, I think that sounds right.
All right. Just didn't want to move on without you. I'd like to remind everyone, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, if you are on WebEx, to just click on the little raise hand button. If you're on the phone only or phone for audio, go ahead and hit *3. *3 will raise your hand if you're just joining on phone. William, we have a few questions in a number of different forms asking for the exact language in the notice where it says that they are not required to conduct a 2021 unsheltered pit count if they conducted a 2020 unsheltered pit count.
I don't know if I can state that here. What I would do is pair the language from where we 24 CFR 578, which is our COC reg. I think it's section 7 is where the pit count requirement is. Probably section C outlines the must do it in the last 10 days of January, at least every other year. So that's kind of the starting place. Then the CPD memo goes over, it has a section in there that reminds about that every other requirement. And then and then goes into how you can seek waivers. So and I know that it explicitly says, and if you did it last year, you don't have to do this. That's not the way these memos get written, and so it doesn't say it as clearly as folks would like. Sorry, we couldn't do that. That's something our lawyers make that call on. So that pairing of those two citations, the memo itself and the 578 Section 7, it looks like C2 reference, should give you that.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd encourage people to continue adding any questions that you have, especially if there's questions on topics that we haven't covered or unique issues that we haven't covered, into the chat and into the Q&A. We have a few very specific HIC questions for this year. The first being, if there's an organization providing motel vouchers, I'm so sorry, excuse me. If there's a hotel shelters that were opened with the brand new COVID-19 funding streams, would these be brand new rows on the HIC?
Again, it depends a little bit on how you set it up in HMIS, right? If again, it's really part of the decompressed shelter, yes, it is new because you're using a hotel voucher, but you're actually doing the data entry based on the clients in there as they're tied to the decompressed shelter, then you're actually just going to report the decompressed shelter, which should be inclusive of the beds that are in that motel voucher. If it's a brand new project you set up in HMIS, yes, you're going to set up a new row and you're going to report that new project in that row.
Wonderful. And then if an organization providing motel vouchers has veterans in some of these, are those specific vouchers/beds considered veteran dedicated?
So veteran dedicated is that concept that it's not about whether someone is in them, it's whether the beds are targeted to serve that population. So if those beds are specifically targeted to our veterans, yeah, you would count them, and there's a chance that part of the beds and not all the beds, that you have that flexibility to enter just the beds dedicated or targeted to. If, again, you have a 100-bed facility and you're serving 50 veterans, not because you're targeting them, but because for whatever reason that's the population you're serving, no, you're not targeting them. You shouldn't report them as veteran-dedicated beds. You will be able to report in the shelter count that they were veterans, but you would not report that they're dedicated veteran beds.
Perfect. A few more HIC questions. If there's a congregate shelter with one large room and 20 beds, should that be considered as one unit with 20 beds or 20 units with 20 beds?
So I laugh because this is the question I think I dealt with first when I took the HIC and PIT, 12, 13 years ago. And we've never really gotten an answer out of it. You actually have the flexibility to choose one of two approaches, right? You could choose the person, or you could choose to identify it with the facility. I believe, and Megan or Aubrey, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we actually said for the congregate, you actually could count, you could just count it as one unit for the 20 beds. But I'll verify with you guys if you know if that's different.
You could do that. I don't think that is the common practice.
Yeah, that's helpful, right? So while it's available, our recommendation would likely be one person per bed, one household is tied to that as well.
Perfect. And we have another individual who's asking if seasonal overflow beds belong on an emergency shelter's bed and unit inventory for the HIC.
Absolutely. Overflow beds have always been there. There's a place to identify overflow beds as such in the HIC, whether they're overflow beds tied as part of an existing facility, or whether you're treating it as a separate. You as a COC actually have the ability to choose how you want to reflect that in the HIC. But yes, count your overflow beds. And it's more or less, if you have a set number of beds, say you have 50 overflow beds, and you lay all 50 overflow beds out, and they're only occupied by 45 people, you'll just have to go through the normal rules, right? You would identify the 50 beds in the HIC, and you would put the 45 people in the pit count portion of the HIC, and that would then, the 45 would flow into the sheltered pit count as well. So just recognize, often overflow is like one person, one bed. That's just, right, like that's how most people do it. So it gets to be pretty easy, but there are some facilities that say, no, we open this segment up every time we hit 40 or 32 degrees. And so we put out 50 cots, and however many people are on the cots are the number that are there that night. So if that's the case, you report the full beds there, as well as the people sleeping in those beds. That's what you report in the pit count portion.
And William, I think you covered this a little bit at the end of that answer right there, but we had someone asking for guidance and suggestions for counting or including warming shelters.
Yeah, warming shelters get included. Generally, you would look at how they're structured, right? Some warming shelters are seasonal because they open up every November 30th and they close April 1st every year, right? So if they're on a set schedule, you'll report them as seasonal, you'll give the dates, and you'll report all the people and all the beds. Again, kind of normal rules about how you report people in beds that I just outlined. If your warming shelters are ad hoc or temperature driven, but again, they're not based on a normal schedule, you'll report those as overflow beds, but do include them.
Wonderful. So popping back to deduplication, William, we have a COC that's asking about entering or cross-referencing their short surveys into HMIS to assist with deduplication and adding information on subpopulations. Can you talk about if that's allowed, if that's advised, and what might be the parameters around that?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to enter it into HMIS. That is a possibility. You actually could export your HMIS folks included and cross-check that against your list. Again, if you do that, I would probably follow the de-identification process, but one that allows you to have a common way of comparing the people who are in your piece that's not in HMIS, or you just use your HMIS staff and use it that way. So whether you put it into HMIS or you export the HMIS and compare it to that other data, you absolutely can use HMIS to fill in some of the blanks, right? If you know some folks were identified in the count, you weren't able to collect all the demographics, but you know your street outreach person has already entered all that, you definitely can do that. And in fact, one approach here might be if you're using your street outreach teams and they know that data is there, you might like put a little tally box in your data collection form saying street outreach worker verified this person is in HMIS, and then you just put there enough information to be able to find them in HMIS and move on, right? Don't collect any more information. You don't need to do that. It's actually safer for the COVID purposes for you to keep moving. So that's a good approach for you. And I'd say this doesn't just apply in this COVID context. We actually strongly encourage you to use your HMIS data as validation point in your normal pit count process. It brings a level of comfort and verification when you know, as most of you are using street outreach every year for your pit count, and they have familiarity with folks. Take advantage of that, right? Like we want you to take advantage of that. The less work for you to do in data entry, the better.
Wonderful. So, William, back to a few HIC questions. If a seasonal shelter, a shelter that was a seasonal shelter, has changed to operating year-round, how should that be noted for the HIC, sheltered pit count, and or in HMIS?
So Megan and Aubrey may be best to make sure I don't screw this up, but I would say the starting point is go into your HMIS, update your project record to reflect the change in status. If you do that, that should actually flow pretty well into all the other segments. So your HIC, you would easily be able to identify it as year-round. You actually would just put all of the data of the beds in your year-round section. In the HIC, you would ensure for LSA purposes, if you've updated your HMIS record, that would flow into your LSA information. So just the key is making sure you update your HMIS project setup correctly, or your project, and then that should flow into the other data sets pretty well.
All right. And William, should projects that aren't operating on the night of the HIC and PIT be included?
Generally, the answer is no, because this is about more or less a point in time, right? So if they're not operating that night, we're not going to count them for the purposes of the HIC evaluation and pit count evaluation. The one caveat we put with that is rapid rehousing has always been a mess. Our data collection in the HIC is certainly far from perfect for rapid rehousing. We've allowed continuums, especially because you often use this for other purposes than just submitting your HIC to HUD. You can enter a rapid rehousing with 0 beds. We've only allowed it to date on rapid rehousing. It just gets really confusing to keep the other facilities on there. So that's what I would say for now. It's just rapid rehousing. You can enter them if you didn't have people with rapid rehousing vouchers that night for whatever reason, but that's kind of an ongoing rapid rehousing project.
Perfect. Returning to some of the questions about warming shelters or warming centers, what should a community do if a warming center doesn't have any beds?
Not enter it.
Perfectly straightforward.
I think to add to that, though, if there's a warming shelter that was open on the night of the HIC, but they don't have any beds, the people who are technically residing there, if they are not counted as sheltered, should most likely be counted as unsheltered if they're experiencing homelessness, right, William?
Yeah, so maybe
depending on
maybe I was distinguishing. You could be treating a warming shelter with no beds in 2 ways, either as a day shelter, so it's still providing services, but it's not providing lodging accommodations. If that's the case, yeah, you're not going to report them. It's a day shelter. We don't report day shelters in the HIC. If, for whatever reason, they're providing housing, but they're not providing beds, right, they're sleeping on the floor or something, yeah, we would count that in as an unsheltered situation.
All right. So if a community has a program, such as a housing support program that serves both clients who have been experiencing homelessness as well as those who were not experiencing homelessness but unstably housed, should that program be included on the HIC, or should it include all beds or just those beds that require homelessness as in entry requirements?
So this one's complicated because of the tie to LSA. So the short answer is you should not include people who are, if you have like a set number of beds that are definitely not going to people who are homeless, you shouldn't include those people or the beds associated with them. If that applies to you, you really should have 2 project setups is the short answer. Because when it comes to the LSA, you don't have a way of prorating projects when you get to the LSA. That's not an option. So you'll have a different problem down the road. That actually will impact your system performance measures as well. So I would encourage you to do 2 project setups in that case, just to make sure that your data lines up correctly in all of the places that you're going to end up sending data.
To clarify, William, do you mean 2 project setups in your HMIS, in their HMIS?
Yes, thank you. 2 projects in HMIS, only one of those will have data that gets submitted in the HIC and in the other data sets.
That's right. One will be a COC project and the other will not.
Right.
Perfect. So turning to a slightly longer and more nuanced question about unsheltered pit count methodology, we've talked a little bit before about using a COC by name list and HMIS to call and talk with individuals that may be experiencing unsheltered homelessness during the pit count. This attendee wants to know if it's okay to use volunteers in this process. And their big concern is around privacy and the data that people have chosen to share by entering in their information into HMIS, and if that's okay to share with volunteers to do this contact and calling.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you'd have to start with actually looking at your privacy notice. That's your very first thing that's going to govern what gets shared with anybody. So that's where you're going to start. Generally, I didn't, in all the kind of back and forth we've had on this with other folks, I did not envision you using volunteers. For this, I envision you using somebody who has an existing relationship with the people that they're calling. That way you don't have this type of issue, right? All of the privacy stuff is covered, and they should obviously be already have access for HMIS purposes. If you're going to use volunteers for that, again, you're going to have to start with your privacy notice and make sure that you have the ability to do that. If your privacy notice is broad enough to allow it, yes, they can do the calls. Again, I don't know that I would recommend that, though, because these calls are really being made as in a relationship context at that point. So I wouldn't recommend it because it just is odd for relationship purposes.
Perfect. Knowing that we may or may not have an answer for this, William, we have a few people who have been asking if veterans who are staying in hotels with the SSVF EHA, Emergency Housing Assistance Funds, how they should be counted in the PIT and if they should be counted as literally homeless.
That's a great question. So we've been talking to the VA about this. The short answer is we're still trying to figure out how you're going to report them. The VA has said, sure, report them as shelter. The problem is it's not that easy based on how the data was initially collected. So if you can't disaggregate folks who are in rapid rehousing from those in that program because they were reported in a single project, you're not actually able to say who's in shelter versus who's in rapid rehousing. So that's the piece we're still noodling through. We hope to be able to give you an answer shortly on that, but again, as you may be experiencing because you're in that boat, that does not have a simple solution to it. So what we want to avoid is making you set up another project. That, again, seems awful. We kind of are avoiding anything that makes you guys set up new projects if we can. But in this case, that might have to be how we go. So we'll continue to talk to the VA and we'll get back to folks.
Wonderful. So definitely stay tuned for that. I do want to remind everyone, if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally, again, you can hit the raised hand button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or if you're on the phone only or phone for audio, you can hit *3 to raise your hand. We do have another question at the moment saying that a COC has fewer volunteers to conduct their unsheltered pit count, so their pit count numbers are likely to be lower this year than in previous years. Do they need to justify why that's the case in the HDX?
So I like this question for lots of reasons. One of the big ones is in past years, it's actually happened in some years for many COCs because volunteer bases change. We would encourage you to take the opportunity now to consider like what your extrapolation approach should be. If you use an appropriate extrapolation measure, you actually could account for those gaps, right? So I kind of hate to hear the like, I have fewer people doing the count, which means I have fewer people counted. No, that may mean you have fewer people counted for the purposes of your sample, but you actually could still extrapolate to account for those gaps in your counting, right, in your sample. So I know that that's much easier for me to say on this call than it is for you to implement in your communities when you have kind of the data in front of you. So my short answer would be let's start, or the kind of longer answer, I guess, is start by looking at, is there a way to account for the gap by using sampling and extrapolation techniques? If so, do that. That's a great starting point. That's a really important starting point. If not, you're going to report what you're going to report. I will tell you for HUD's messaging, we are definitely going to tell folks when we release whatever it is that we release with the 2021 data that this is not an apples to apples comparison either at the COC level or at the national level to the 2020 count or past counts at all. And it won't be a very accurate way to reflect what happens compared to 2022 either, right? They're just different ways that people are counting. What you should do if you're going to do any comparison, and we'll likely do something very minimal, is just point to, do you have enough confidence in the way you're counting to be able to say your count went up or down? That's our threshold for this entire 2021 count process. If you in your community are looking at your efforts and you can't confidently say that this data reflects just, again, a thumbs up, thumbs down, we're higher or lower than last year, then you should probably consider submitting an exception. If you're confident you can say, yeah, it went up or down, but I have no idea by how much, that's fine. Like, you're in the camp with like everyone else who's actually doing a count. And that's the thing we want to communicate for everyone to hear, the public to hear, Congress to hear. There's no precision in what we're going to get in the 2021 count. What we're going to get is a vague sense of, is homelessness going up or is it going down, or unsheltered homelessness in different types of communities. So that's the message I think we will use.
Perfect. Thank you so much, William. And you actually, I think, started to head off another question, may have fully answered another question. I'm not sure if you want to add anything else. We had another attendee ask about any tips or any suggestions for messaging this data when they release it and share it with their local community, with their funders, with their partners, about how to correctly nuance and give context to this won't be comparable to other years, and what it might or might not tell them about the effects of the pandemic. Yeah,
so what I just said obviously applies here, right? The big thing is this is not a precision estimate where you can compare, we went up 5.3%. Nobody should be making statements like that if you're not conducting a full-blown count, and there are very, very few COCs who are doing that. So that's certainly the starting line. What I would say, this is similar to other years of Pit Count in many ways. This is a time to make the pitch about what's going on in unsheltered homelessness, right? It's, look, we may not know exactly how many there are, but they're clearly there. Like, we're experiencing a pandemic, and we still have at least 300 people sleeping on the streets. That's a powerful message, right? And that's one that you should be using as you're making, trying to influence those who are making vaccine prioritization decisions and other things, right? It's this kind of communication. Obviously, that vaccine distribution piece will hopefully be done by the time you get your results. Hopefully, we'll have had the opportunity largely to be vaccinated. But there are other decisions around funding, around especially complication of COVID. Use this as the opportunity to say, even if this is not a perfect count, we still found this many people, right? That's a terrible thing to be happening in winter during COVID. So that's the message that we definitely want to make sure communities hear loud and clear from every level, from the elected level down to the citizen base. We all need to be aware of that and put it as a priority to address.
Thank you so much for adding that, William. It does look like some of our unique questions are starting to dry up at this point, so I would encourage all of our attendees, if you have any remaining questions, things that haven't been asked, answered, or covered, to add those into the chat or Q&A, or to raise your hand by clicking on the raise hand button or *3 on your phone if you've joined audio on your phone. With that, we're going to do one last check to see if we have any more questions. While we do that, William, were there any notes that you want to share at this moment?
So I can't reiterate enough how grateful I am and we at HUD are for the efforts you're doing. Even if you're not conducting a count, those COCs that I've talked to, you took the time to figure out, can I do it safely? Like, that's what we care about. We care about the people we serve. And the pit count is not a torturous activity that HUD wants you to do because we like giving you pain. You may feel that way many times, but really we care about the people on the street. And the pit count is often the only vehicle that we have to figure out what's going on for you at the community level and for us, and to be able to message that this is a terrible thing. and we need to address it. It's serious. But I don't want that to overshadow this is not easy. And you guys are working through it. You're in the middle of it. You have a million different priorities. If we see this, we are so grateful for it, and we want to be supportive of you. So a lot of our things that we're doing are just trying to support you as you support those folks who need that, who can't do it for themselves for one reason or another. So a big thank you for all of your work and being patient with us. Again, things like this memo, how does that apply to these waivers or the exceptions? Some of these things were like threading weird legal threads here that are odd and they don't make sense on the surface. There are things we have to do just to make sure everyone's covered, and we know it creates some confusion. So we're sorry about that, but again, can't thank you enough for sticking with it, being patient with us, but again, putting your priorities on serving those that really need it the most.
Thank you so much, William. It doesn't look like we had any more questions come in. So as we head towards the end of this office hours, I do want to remind everyone that the final 2021 Pit Count office hours will be on January 19th, 2021 at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That registration link is available on the HUD Exchange and has been sent out via listserv for that final office hours. If you have ideas for that, you can still drop them in the chat until this webinar is closed, and we'll still get those. William, any other parting thoughts or notes? All right. With that, thank you everyone for attending today. Aubrey Sittler has been kind enough to share that registration link into the chat. That will stay there for you, and we hope that you will join us on our next Pit Count office hours. And that concludes our webinar.